John Dawson is the Vice President of Strategy at Jellyfish. John is one of the world's foremost strategists, pioneering how global brands navigate marketing in the age of generative AI. Featured in Harvard Business Review, In-Seed Knowledge, and the Journal of Brand Strategy, John is the mind behind Jellyfish's proprietary share of model platform, which measures how brands are perceived and recommended across LLMs like ChatGPT, Perplexity, and Claude. Having led strategy across the US, China, Europe, and Australia for brands like Google, Unilever, and Converse, he sits at the absolute forefront of generative engine optimization and brand demand planning for the AI era. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I know I gave your current bio in context of, the most pressing thoughts of the day, which is how is AI impacting how brands show up in the world. But maybe you can contextualize things for us a little bit. So if we go back, what did you study? Where did you grow up? And what got you into the world of agency land and doing brand strategy?
Well, I'm originally from Australia, from Sydney, and I was graduating with a degree with Spanish and politics. And I was about to graduate, and I really had no idea what I was going to do for a career. And I found myself in a bookstore, and I was sort of going through this bookstore, and I just grabbed a whole bunch of books, and one of them was Confessions of an Advertising Man with David Ogilvy.
Wow!
And I read that book, and I was like, "Wow, advertising sounds pretty good." I emailed the editor of an Australian marketing and media website. I said, "Hey, I'm graduating with this degree. I've never done or studied advertising. I have no idea, but I read this book and it sounds fantastic. Could I have coffee and just chat with you about what the market's like, how I might be able to get a foot in the door?" And the editor replied and said, "I'll do you one better. Next week, I'm putting on a careers day at this conference. You should come along." I was like, "Great, amazing timing." Went to the careers day, heard a bunch of people talk about their career in advertising, and one of the lines was, "You don't have to join the Navy to travel the world, you just work in advertising." I thought, wow, that really appeals to me. And met some people. I thought, wow, these are really energetic, interesting people doing work that lives in the world. And followed up that night with some people I'd met, had an internship the next morning, started the week after, and that's pretty much set me off in the career. And 15 years later, I've spent time in Sydney, Copenhagen, Shanghai, and now New York. And I think each of those times I've been able to learn from some really incredible leaders, and been, I think, at each of those times at a real period of sort of change, either in my own life or in the world of advertising. And we're sort of in another one of those periods now with everything happening with AI.
Yeah, that's wild. It almost did like you were destined on how seamless you make it sound. I'm sure it was harder than that, but I love that story. Like, being curious and reaching out for conversational interviews. I think young people who are maybe struggling to figure out, what's the first step in their career can, take some of that advice to just be brave and, reach out and extend your hand and ask for help. And a lot of people, especially, I feel like when young people ask me for help, it's hard to be a jerk and say no. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, I was having coffee with someone the other day that, cold emailed me, and it's the easiest thing in the world to say, "Great, I've got 15 minutes, 30 minutes, come for a coffee, or let's jump on a quick Zoom." But not many people do it. I think you should always just DM. You've got nothing to lose. So if anyone's, finishing college or interested, I think always DM people, always send them a message. I don't think anyone's going to reply with anything rude. That at worst going to just ignore you. And at best, you might open a new set of doors. So I completely agree, Dylan.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. All right. So how'd you find your way to Jellyfish?
So I was in China. I went to China in 2019, which was either great timing or very bad timing, depending on, your perspective, I guess. But went to China, obviously 2020 happened, borders closed, stayed really, in China for a number of years until the borders opened up.
Wow.
And
So you were in China during COVID.
yeah, I was right there. It was a pretty interesting experience. I think
I can imagine.
2020 was China was probably one of the best places in the world to be, because the virus was something really happening outside, and the border controls were very strict, so life was pretty normal. But then it got a little bit weird in 2022, where the rest of the world was opening up, and then China was sort of back down to lockdowns and pretty severe restrictions. But we can talk about pandemic another time.
Sure.
Back to work. So I was sort of, after 4 years in China, I was sort of looking for opportunities in the US, and knew a number of people who worked at Jellyfish after it was acquired by the Brandtech Group, and a number of my former colleagues from sort of Group M Mindshare world were now working at Jellyfish. And a very similar thing, a door opened. I happened to be traveling to the US, was able to have a coffee with someone, and very quickly line something up and move it and get started. And since moving to the US and working with Jellyfish, that's been really my professional home.
Love it. Well, let's get into some of your work around generative engine optimization. So the keyword, what is share of model? You published a landmark paper in Harvard Business Review called Forget What You Know About Search. Marketers spent over 2 decades obsessing over Google search rank and share of voice. Why should they be thinking of share of model now? And why should CMOs care more about how LLMs their brand, whether they rank in traditional search engines?
Yeah, I think in the time since that first paper was published in Harvard Business Review to now, I think the awareness level across the industry has really exploded. And for most marketers, I think there's a broad understanding that all of these AI models sit between them and their next customer, whether they work in highly technical B2B areas, whether their primary audience is procurement, whether they're in fast-moving consumer goods, and whether they work in the US or any other country in the world. And our philosophy towards this era has been one informed by our experience working in other channels and digital experiences. And a big part of that is not just thinking about organic, but looking at what it means for your paid and earned strategies as well. I think if you've worked in the industry for a bit of time, there's lots of similar echoes through the past in how the AI space has been evolving. Think back to the early 2010s and social, and everyone was like, it's all about organic. You just post and get your likes and engagement. And now we've known that social is an ad machine. It's about driving reach
Pay to play,
and performance. Right? Totally. And if you rewind another 15 years before there, you have similar things about search. Search is all organic, but now we know search is an ad machine. And similar sorts of trends are just repeating. And the way that we've built share of model for the last couple of years has been with that in mind. That we really believe that marketers need to look at, yes, perception and placement from an organic standpoint, but then really apply that into their paid campaigns. What does that mean for the way you activate across Google, ChatGPT ads, our other integrations with things like TikTok search ads and Reddit, as well as then your earned strategies, what sorts of publishers and PR to prioritize, and even things like what types of YouTube creators to work with. We have a YouTube creators API, and that helps identify certain creators that you might want to collaborate with. I think that's a really big piece of where the industry is at the moment in this new space. It's still pretty early, but if we take a bit of a broader view, which is what we sort of did in that Journal of Brand Strategy article, is try to place what's happening right now in AI marketing with what's happened before, and to really track that as these systems mature, you're going to have implications beyond just organic tricks, and really need to think about, as a mature ad platform, as part of your integrated strategy, what can you use from an insight standpoint and what can you use from an ad format standpoint that can help drive your business growth.
It's really interesting. You're the first person I've heard talk about, AEO or LLMs from the perspective of paid and what types of paid strategies can leverage the way that LLMs working, or maybe, optimize, because I totally agree with you. It's like everything starts from the perspective of like, how do you game these platforms organically while they still are nascent and they don't care about ads or advertising or monetization, at least at the face value. And really all they care about is users and growth. And then eventually everybody has to start paying the bills. And, ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is, the first large LLM that you kind of start to see advertising. And then, Anthropic made a Super Bowl commercial about it, fun of them. So you even have these brands fighting against each other in their marketing messaging on who's holding out the longest, to avoid paid advertising. But, and then you go look at Gemini and Google, which are the most logical places in the world for ads to be, informed buttoning in the LLMs and the strategy. So, I've heard a bunch of great suggestions 6 months on how to have a paid strategy, how to have an organic strategy, things like PR, et cetera. But could you maybe users, if you were to say, hey, you need to start thinking about paid, where are 2 or 3 places where you would start thinking about adding to their paid strategy to leverage this new way of people searching for brands?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, look for the ways in which you show up organically, but don't limit your optimizations to those organic levers alone. The way that we work, with clients through their ChatGPT ad strategy, for example, is you can start to see the market from the perspective of your organic presence, which can really inform then how you build ad groups and ad strategies for your ChatGPT campaigns. And getting into those environments, with the consistency and certainty that paid advertising gives clients is a really important confidence driver in the ability for new channels to start to contribute to a business's outcomes. The ability now with ChatGPT ads to upload audiences, do DMA testing, as well as split out different ad groups, you can really start to isolate impact across different sorts of tactics and landing pages and things like that. So it's early, it's experimental. I'd say it's really an exciting time. At Jellyfish, we have a very, very active ChatGPT ads Slack channel with everyone experimenting, sharing learnings, their testing programs, and really from a platform perspective, it's probably evolved more in the last 4 months than any ad platform has ever in history. I mean, from uploading sort of CSV files to the launch of the Ads Manager, and now conversion API, audience targeting. It's moving really at leaps and bounds. From a Google side, Google is still the number one vehicle for discovery. If we then start to think about the role that YouTube has, Gmail, plus the search ecosystem, it's absolutely fundamental that advertisers don't see AI and think OpenAI alone. From a advertiser standpoint on Google, with in-share model, we have native integrations. One for PMax allows advertisers in just 3 minutes and 3 clicks to get about 30% improvement in their return on ad spend. We do that by comparing the sorts of themes that the models think about with the themes that you have running in your PMax account. The ability then for marketers to think about not just the ads, but I mentioned before, YouTube is really important when you start to consider what happens when Gemini comes into that YouTube ecosystem. So one thing from Google Marketing Live that they released a few months ago now, which I thought was really interesting, was the Ask YouTube feature, which basically brings Gemini into YouTube. And that means that all of the videos that you have suddenly now tell Gemini things about your brand, product, service. From our research, we know that in most categories, 90% of the YouTube citations don't come from brands themselves. They come from UGC and third-party sources in the YouTube ecosystem. So then even when you think about your creator strategy, how are you informing creators to speak about your product and service in a way that will appeal to the models so that the brand's going to show up, and that content might show up in things like AI mode as those become more and more video, image, and text driven themselves too.
Wow, that's really interesting. So you can start to think about your creator briefs from the of AEO optimization. This, I think, adage for a really long time with creator marketing to, provide bullet points and key messages, but not write scripts. Do you think that has to change in this world where, optimizing, like having brand consistency with if 90% of citations are coming from third parties, but then these third parties are all talking about your brand in different ways because they're trying to translate it to their audience. Do you think creator briefs need to be tighter? Do we have to start thinking about more scripting versus kind of letting creators do their thing? Be curious on your take there.
Yeah, I think we will. I think we'll see a maturing and more diversified creator set of strategies. And I think we'll see that driven, yes, by the new need to be speaking, articulate in coherent and consistent ways that models will pick up and reinforce the attributes that you need to be talking to. But we'll probably also see it as a consequence of increased scale and commercial prioritization for creator content. In China, when I was working there, 30% plus of an advertiser spend would just be on creator content. And it was treated as, effectively a channel like any other. Creators were responsible for driving sales, they were driving engagement, driving interest in the brand that was ultimately measured against, revenue figures. And if creators couldn't deliver that, well, they were retired from, the creator mix that they were using in a certain brand. So I think that both of those aspects, performance for models and performance for commercial outcomes, are probably going to drive diversified set of creator strategies in the same way that, any format, marketers, should be testing different messaging strategies. Creators is another one of those vehicles that should as well. I think the other important factor for thinking about YouTube creators as well is the half-life of citations is considerably longer than necessarily the half-life of a video from sort of viewer and engagement. Like if you think about a typical creator campaign, an agency and a marketer will launch a campaign, they'll report back, here are our 30-day views. Did the views surpass a certain level? Did they not? And that time frame often defines whether or not something's successful. But from our research across many categories, we see videos that are over 2 years old appearing in citations from channels that have very few subscribers. And it changes the arithmetic in terms of how a marketer can evaluate the success of any piece of creator content. Its ability to drive views on day one versus citations on day 1,000 are going to mean different things to different people, and they can sit at different priorities sort of based on the funnel as well. If you have really detailed creator videos that are dealing with common objections that the models might have to your product or service, that might not drive a lot of interest from a person, but can be a really important part of your messaging ecosystem to shore up reputation when the models consider your product as part of a set of options.
It's really interesting. You touched on a bunch of things. One, I think, is that China is just so far ahead of us when it pertains to creator strategy, maybe a lot of things. You mentioned that 30% of budgets are going to creators, but that there's no such thing in China as a that drives brand awareness. You the creators in China convert to revenue. They drive sales. And the other thing that I thought was interesting is the shopping trend, where there were easily multi-million-dollar selling days. Now, the apps are a little bit more integrated, where the social media apps are also the e-commerce apps and maybe a little bit more frictionless in China. But this idea of like the performance-driven creator, a creator who can drive sales versus awareness and brand, I think disappearing now in the US and has in the China models for sure. But now you're talking about this new idea of like citation of your creator content. When you think about historical models that sales are from a creator are driven from like a live shopping, an affiliate link, being able to hook into the creator content and boost it with paid, is the citations that are coming from creator content, is it attributable in any way? Because it's one thing to see a citation inside of a chatbot and you'd be like, oh, cool, that's awesome. But you're not necessarily clicking through to the creator page to see the video and to click on the affiliate link. You're just seeing it in your Gemini bot or your ChatGPT bot. You're like, cool, okay, well, now I'm just going to go search for the brand and make a conversion because I'm ready to buy. I don't need to go, click out. So how do you think that's contribution?
Well, I think this is something where we can start to imagine where these sorts of interfaces are heading. So, that behavior that you described, I think, is pretty typical for the moment, where you have an interaction in a chat ecosystem, and then you will learn information and migrate to, for example, the open web to search for particular products and be guided through then further steps along the journey. From our research, we've seen that, for ChatGPT, for example, the number one action before and after is Google search. So there's clearly a sort of a symbiotic relationship between, AI and, a traditional quote unquote search experience that people would be familiar with. But I think over time, the signals that I think we're starting to see from Google and OpenAI suggest that there will be more multimodal text, image, video content in these answers, and that even the ads themselves are going to be built based on the specific content of the conversation. So I'll give you an example. If we're thinking about a fairly common creator category like lipsticks or cosmetics, you're right that there's a significant attribution challenge that if your creative video appears as a citation, are you clicking to the video? Are you then searching? How do we work out how that connects? But in a world where commerce can happen in a chat and every chat is a checkout, that actual content, the video clip, is very likely that over time that will actually migrate into the answer itself. Again, one of the interesting ways to sort of think about how this might develop is in China, and Baidu, which is sort of the Google equivalent, their answers now are fully sort of multimodal. So you might get a fully AI generated video answer for you, and that might pull on full Gen AI clips, but it could also pull on clips from across the internet as well. And I think we're seeing signs that same sort of stuff is going to happen across Google. From an attribution standpoint, then I don't work at Google, but I think for creators, there's probably going to be a similar type of deal that happens like, sort of AdSense, where, if your content is included in, the answers that leads to conversion, it feels like that's a pretty clear affiliate opportunity that could help creators as well as support the sort of content ecosystem. And moreover, with AI Max, even the way that ads are built are going to be sort of pieced together in more of a multimodal way. So AI Max at the moment, you have the sort of ad will be built in the sort of conversation, similar sort of an extension of sort of Performance Max, where rather than advertisers building finished ads, you build elements, and those elements are then brought together into what Google, I mean, this is sort of similar with the other platforms about what the platforms believe is going to be the most effective ad to convert that user. It's very easy to imagine that elements of that ad might also include things like YouTube clips, might include citations from other parts of the web, could include, publishers that have opted in. And I think that those sorts of ad formats are going to appear to be more diverse than they necessarily are today. And some of that multimodal experience that's coming into play in AI mode, I think will point to the way that ads will also work across that ecosystem too.
Noticed my podcast research, usually at the end I'll say, Gemini, tell me who John Dawson is and give me 10 questions that I should ask him based on all my historical shows, and it does a really great job. And then now what I'm noticing is the last thing it returns is what it thinks is your most relevant interview that it could ever find historically that's already on YouTube. So I see the video inclusion and the YouTube results being included more often in that search format already. So yeah, that's going to be really interesting as that all starts to get pulled into a paid experience that then, for Google drives value for their advertisers and potentially people who contributed to it, whether that's creators or publishers or, other folks being pulled in. That's really an exciting world. So I'd be curious your take on AI Max. There was a little bit of controversy when AI Max launched, and you had already started to see this inside of Advantage Plus, inside of Facebook, where, media buyers were seeing, taglines change, images, background images change. Basically they thought they had control of their brand. AI platforms and media buying entities inside of the cells are not just take optimization, but they're taking over creative. As someone who's come through the agency world, reading, David Ogilvy's book, a lot of what agencies and brands want to do is maintain their voice, their consistency, their guidelines. And it's moving to this world where we have to kind of hand that control over. Be curious, do you think that's a good thing? Do you think AI saying, hey, this ad is for 75% of people who advertise on Google, so this change be made, but then maybe it's not good for the other 25%? A race to kind of maximum see, but there is a bit of handing your brand over and not being in control of the driver's seat anymore. Be curious if you've had conversations with colleagues or clients about that and what people are saying in orders of the world.
Yeah, I think, even a question like, is it good? Good is so not so much subjective, but good is a value that is largely changing advertiser to advertiser. I think across the ecosystem, marketers will have to make a call on the degree of control that they want and the degree of autonomy that they'll give. And there will be a whole range of marketers that I imagine will be largely be determined by their ambition to drive an outcome. A dollar at all costs on one extreme, like I will get the sale no matter what. That type of a marketer and that type of a brand can go all in. No control. What matters is the revenue. That's it. The ends justifies all the means. And you will have on the other side
brand
marketers. Yeah, and I think even the degree to which what type of asset even is worth having that level of control. Is an ad that appears in an AI mode answer, do you want the same level of control over that as you do the billboard that is going to be running, on Fifth Avenue? Probably not. I mean, those two assets operate in different ways, and the way that people will experience them will also change, and their role is different. So I expect that will be part of a lot of AI governance plans that happen from marketers themselves, because how media is traded and how brands, or assets, I should say, are built, are actually for the first time colliding. For the longest time, basically my whole career, technology has been on the side of media buying, like programmatic, and the actual asset has been fairly traditional sets of finished assets that are then put into platforms based on programmatic bidding. But now, for the first time, you have two things happening. You have algorithmic media plus Gen AI creative. And I think it really does change the asset equilibrium that marketers need to think about. You've got huge supply side pressure. You need more assets more often to fund, from an asset standpoint, to fund these media channels. And that puts pressure on traditional ways of thinking about sort of the command and control structure of building ads. And that's why I think if you look at, the AI Max and P Max and these other sorts of algorithmically delivered media and creative formats, marketers, I think, will be building sort of ingredients and guidelines rather than necessarily finished ads. And the guidelines matter because you're basically building, the rules of the road and the barriers, and what type of asset are you willing to give X control up to? What are your standards? How do you build QA into that? And then the ingredients, because your ad will get built at the impression. Your ad isn't built in the agency necessarily anymore and then signed off and put out into the world. These ads could look different. That has obviously a lot of challenges around approval process, traditional briefing. How do we know what worked? How do we test? But I think anything that drives, a positive outcome for a brand should be tested. But ultimately, each brand needs to make a call for themselves, whether they are comfortable with the control and ownership of whatever the finished experience of their brand is.
So maybe you give platforms kind of your master brand guidelines, your brand Bible, if you will, your colors, font, logos, iconography, and maybe even your copywriting and your manifesto. And then maybe an asset of like, here's what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to do, and here are the assets for the current campaign. And AI gets to pull from those places and generate assets in real time, sometimes maybe in a moment, based on, personalization, even like this is a unique ad for this unique person.
Yeah.
It still ladders up to that higher hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of small business marketing, the platforms have already shown the capability that they will be able to take and invent a brand from a website and produce the assets that run across those media formats. Then for enterprise marketers, I think it's about how do you build, retain distinct assets that leave an indelible mark about who you are versus the competition, and then be able to apply insights across platforms. And at Brand Tech Group, that Jellyfish is a part of, we have a generative AI platform called Pencil. It's been around since 2018. It's worked with over 5,000 advertisers to produce over 5 million AI ads. And exactly what you said about building the brand library is so important, the first step. I open LinkedIn every day. Maybe you see this as well. You open LinkedIn and someone goes, hey, I prompted my way to a brand. Look at all these ads I make. And you look at them and you go, well, they look pretty similar to the stuff I saw yesterday when someone said I can prompt my way to great ads. And I think there is this real risk of convergence. And marketers have spent decades and billions of dollars to build a brand that's unique to them. And if you don't set up those guardrails and those core aspects of your identity that make it AI ready so that you retain that IP and that distinction, you could just lose it all. And I think that's a really important part of this sort of governance and testing aspect as well is to make sure that you continue to build the brand and the business, because people that will encounter your ads, whether it's in a chatbot or it's on a YouTube pre-roll or on CTV, are also the ones that are going to be walking into the store. They're the ones who will be receiving the package from Amazon and recognizing, yes, they bought the thing, and they recognize the brand. So that's a really important aspect, is for the things that do change, also the things that don't, your brand needs to be really clear and coherent across any AI piece of work that's generated.
A lot of agencies are treating GEO like SEO 2.0, putting keywords into articles and hoping ChatGPT picks them up. But LLMs don't index web pages the same way Google's crawlers do. What's a fundamental tactical difference in how a brand optimizes its presence for generative AI models versus traditional search algorithm? I think there's two important parts to this. The first is that, unlike traditional search, these models have been trained to have an opinion about your brand and product already. And so as a starting point, we need to treat these models not just as an interface, but as a gatekeeper that will pass judgment on your brand and product. And so in Share a Model, we have a module called Brand Perception that starts by actually looking at, hey, what do you, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, what do you think about these brands? And then through a process called embeddings, we build out these perception maps. So that's the first key part of the difference, is that, there's a fundamental perception that an awareness that these models have about your brand and business that you need to build into your broader content strategy, not just about web pages, but product information pages, investor relations material, your FAQs, for some technical clients in the B2B space and manufacturing, even your spec sheets for all of your products and materials. So that's the first one. And the second one is, we are now building around context. One of the sort of other concepts that I've been developing over the past several months is called context entry points. Now, traditionally in marketing, we have these category entry points, where, we think about a category, the way we get into it shapes the brands that come to mind. A really simple example would be, if I'm at the beach, I'm thinking about beer, okay, like Corona is going to come to mind. Whereas if I'm at on a rainy day at a pub, Guinness will come to mind. And so when we think about that in the world of models, context really shapes how these models respond. And this sort of fragmentation of queries is that you and I could go on, start with the same intent around buying a beer, but sitting in different places with different preferences, different contexts about who we are and what we bought before and what we like, who we might be buying it for and drinking it with, will all shape different ways that the models respond. And that's a big difference too. Keywords are, sort of a point in time. You have a concept that's, static, and you optimize towards the keyword. What we're seeing now and working with clients who, when we think about context, is much more dynamic and in many ways much closer to sort of almost traditional comms planning. Thinking about moments and audiences, who your competitive threats are at those occasions, why, and then building targeted communication plans to stand out so that you are seen, preferred, and purchased when these models pass opinion about what to get
next time that you say, I need a beer?
In the example of I need a beer, is it because that's a great example, by the way, and totally I get it. Like you're in the mood for a different type of beer depending on, maybe you want a non-alcoholic beer, after a workout, or maybe you want a light beer because you're on a diet, so many contexts and things that kind of come with, time of day, occasion, weather, like you mentioned. Does that come into play on the way we use agentic chatbots that is like a different way of searching? Like I find my search queries are massive inside of AI, where it might be paragraphs that I'm cut and pasting from somewhere, or I'm, dictating, or pulling a note from, being on a jog and just talking a voice note, or literally just hitting like, I didn't really use Amazon Alexa a ton or Siri, but I do find myself using ChatGPT, just hit the conversation button and have a conversation with it. So is it that in the context of a search, it has so much more context, or is it also taking into consideration those types of factors like, hey, I know my consumer is in Cancun right now because of his IP address, and I'm going to recommend a Corona because those are the beers that people like to drink at the beach?
Yeah, it's both. And I think that what you just hit on there is also a really important part, where this isn't just SEO 2.0, that the actual experience and form factors changed a lot. I'm like you, I guess, like turn on voice and just dump straight into it. And, it goes on and on and on. And I might trail off as I'm trying to work out what I want to buy, or buying a gift for someone. I'm explaining, oh, they liked this when I bought it, but didn't, really dumping. And you're right, it's a completely different set of experiences that we're trying to build a brand into. And in many ways, I think it, again, thinking back, it's like those, comms planning roles, when you enter a context, enter a category moment, how is our brand going to be the one that stands out? And what's interesting is even in categories, I've got a sort of a visual here, contextentrypoints.com, which, you can click through and see how these models actually think visually through how, when context changes, they think about different brands and products.
Do you want to bring it up on the screen?
Yeah, let me, I'll show you, because
there you go.
So, this is really an experiment that was built out of that, observation through show of model, that anytime that we shift the context around market, audience, physical location, demographics, category, the models would think about different products. And typically, in show of model, it's presented in a graph, but we want to show this in a bit of a visual way. So you can see, for example, here we have sunny outdoor gathering in a lush garden. It's a baby and parenting context, high chair trait mealtime in France. And so you have, obviously these French brands, but even it's in France. So you have, Leffe beer and a Chateau de, well, my French is terrible, but you have these brands, right? And then we, can start to see, what types of, relative share of space that each of these brands have. But each time they come up and we change the context around a market, an audience, it all shifts as well. And so this is just a visual way of demonstrating that these models are sensitive to context. And, again, you open LinkedIn and sometimes you see, top 10 brands in X category for AI. Those are not useful at all for brands. And they're not useful because the world that we're moving into is context dependent. And the number one brand that appears, just in a broad list, fine. But what really happens is context is driven by conversation and by the audience. And so that's where brands need to build their intelligence around, is to understand in these different moments and occasions, am I appearing? How am I appearing, and what competitors are there? Because you don't win, all the way down the funnel in the same way, or across audiences the same way. And that's where you can have some differentiated strategies in your go-to-market plans as well.
Wild. We talked a little bit about this around the idea that AI has an opinion. There's been some argument of whether AI has taste, because taste is maybe unique to the individual, or can a agentic agent emulate my taste? But when a consumer asks Claude or ChatGPT for the best luxury SUV or top enterprise CRM, the AI essentially synthesizes answers from billions of data points, sometimes hallucinating or repeating outdated sentiment. How does Jellyfish audit what an LLM thinks about a Fortune 500 client? And how do you actually fix bad or biased AI brand perception?
So in much the same way, since we started doing the, rolling out the platform a couple of years ago, and I mean, when we started Share of Model, I think GEO wasn't even an acronym.
Wow.
So it's been a bit of a journey. And in that time, we've seen those sorts of things too. And the way we look at it is, validate the answer against a source of truth, which might be a brand's website, but even sometimes a brand's own website might have slightly out of date stuff. So we sometimes say to an advertiser, what is the source of truth that we're comparing to? So we can see sort of a truth drift. And then where there is drift, you can audit any of the citations to understand whether there are particular sources that are contributing to that hallucinated or incorrect perception, and then seek to correct them. Or if not in control, thinking about more of a traditional PR approach to start actively messaging around those topics. And that's where I think the traditional sort of silos of marketing have dissolved because of how these AI models think across divisions. Very often, we might be talking to a client about their corporate comms or their employer recruitment material that might be contributing to a perception. Traditionally, those teams might have never talked and certainly never been involved in the same sorts of communication strategy. But now,
they have a different brand, right, to steward, the employer brand versus the consumer brand. But now it has to be even more cohesive, because you never know what part is influencing these things.
Absolutely.
Interesting. All right. If an AI assistant answers a consumer's query, compares products, and makes a recommendation all within a single chat prompt, the traditional awareness, consideration, conversion funnel collapses into a single moment. How does brand demand planning change when the discovery moment is entirely mediated by an AI agent?
I think this is the core question that we've been addressing through our view that AI is going to be a paid, earned, and owned environment. Because those sorts of questions, if we take a bit of a longer historical view, are exactly the same types of challenges that emerge if you look back at industry commentary around search. What happens when people search for a category and your sort of brand's not there, and they click and they buy. And what I think is helpful to think about is the environment and behavior that happens outside of the conversation and the one that happens inside it. The one that happens outside of it, we are still influencing people's behavior in a broad set of ways through exposure to advertising and marketing material. When people want to think about a problem similar to Google search, best scenario is for those people in a need to be searching for the brand. Say, I have X problem that's associated with this brand, search for brands, help me buy it. Now, then you have another set of challenges around, well, how are you directing the sale to that area that's going to be best for the brand? But we can park that to the side. Mm-hmm. For category level conversations, so rather than get me a 6-pack of Corona, what beer should I buy? Those sorts of areas, that's where it's important for marketers to build associations to be prominent in those conversations. But it's also important that they don't rely only on organic to do that job. An ad strategy that is built around being relevant into multiple contexts. And I think a big part of, if you look through the sort of ad schema that ChatGPT ads has, I have the context hints. It's a really important lever that we find in driving additional performance for clients. Having relevant landing pages and content that can then convert and be relevant for the journey. Those are really critical aspects, because you're right that if in certain conversations your brand doesn't appear organically, there is a risk that you miss out on those occasions. But those sorts of risks have happened for a long time in search and even in social, arguably as well, not standing out in the feed. We solve that through understanding the value to the business and then investing in paid advertising to get into that environment. So we believe the same thing will be happening, but there'll be arguably a broader set of levers that an advertiser can pull. Traditionally, even in digital advertising, you had the ad and the audience and the bid, and that got you into the space. But with the early signals from Google and some of the things like direct offers, we could have different levers depending on the audience. And you have a shopper agent that might understand that you are a higher value customer, so let's not reduce the price by X amount, but maybe offer quicker shipping. Or for me, you might be a bundle deal saying, hey, this person is likely to buy not just the beer, but a bottle of vodka as well. So let's bundle that together. So I think it's an exciting time to think about even what the ad bid structure looks like as well, because it's going to get much more intelligent in terms of multiple levers to pull, as well as the ways that creative will come together into that environment in pretty interesting ways.
Yeah, and I think it's a helpful reminder that, there's only 5% of people ever needing your product at that exact moment. And that is still low funnel activity, whether you're searching in Google or searching in ChatGPT. So that doesn't mean you still don't need to be in all the other channels where people can get exposed to your brand, whether that's, there's still plenty of people who see an advertisement on a billboard for smart water and then walk into a grocery store, see it in a case and buy it without ever having talked to a chatbot. All those traditional models still are important.
Absolutely. And I think there's no greater evidence for that than the advertising that these models do themselves. That OpenAI, Anthropic, Google are huge advertisers to promote their features, big outdoor ads, big video ads. And I think that one of the temptations I think always in the industry is to throw out the old for the new, to say, well, this changes everything. And I think you're absolutely right. AI dramatically shifts the way that people can experience brands and products and move through the funnel and get information and even buy at arm's reach. But it also doesn't change many other aspects of how brands are built and products are sold. And holding those two thoughts and learning and testing into new while also continuing to improve on what you've been fundamentally doing for the past 50, 100 years are sort of the two speeds of marketing that marketers have always had to operate at those two speeds: master the new and then improve on the old. And I think that's only becoming more important now.
So we talked a little bit about your time in China, 4 years in Shanghai, leading integrated strategy for Unilever China. This is an ecosystem with WeChat, Douyin, and super apps. They were way ahead in social commerce and algorithmic feeds, as we talked about. What did your time in China teach you about algorithmic consumer behavior that prepped you to lead AI strategy in the West?
China is a cutthroat competitive market. And every brand I had the privilege of working on and marketers I had the privilege of working for, I learnt the acute sense of needing to test and learn to understand if something new is going to drive big value to the business. And so my experience of moving from sort of Australia and Denmark then to China was a real flip from, how do we, in sort of Australia and Denmark was really, how do we build really big rationale to try to convince a client to test this new thing. In China, it's a competitive priority to test new things because your competitors are. And if they learn quicker than you do, they have the opportunity to scale into a channel that could make their year, make their 5 years.
Wow.
And so the imperative to, test at the speed that the market develops, I think is one part of that experience that has stayed with me. And I think the other aspect is the ways in which the ecosystem in China is just so much more integrated. I think that it gave me firsthand experience of what happens when you live only in an app. And in some ways, that could be the direction of travel for some of these AI experiences as well. That your experience sits within the harness, within the AI system, and that information is just abstracted into your chat experience. In the paper in the Journal of Brand Strategy, we talked about the shift from the direct era to the distributed era, now into the ambient era, where sort of information is pulled up into this chat space and you're not having to go into various places. And so I think that's one aspect of my experience in China that's also potentially led me to think more about what happens when more behavior happens in the conversation and doesn't move into a www.brand.com sort of behavior.
Interesting. You're co-leading Jellyfish's US media strategy and working with giants like Google and Converse, as we mentioned, in addition to being one of the AI thought leaders at BrandTech. How are you shifting media allocation in the context of search budgets, which were traditionally somewhat fixed and an important part of the lower funnel performance media allocation? But as consumers divide their time between Google searches and these new interfaces, how does that actually practically affect budgets for paid search? Is it a meaningful number that's moving from traditional over to ChatGPT ads?
I would say for most clients, it's still in the testing period. And part of that as well is, as I mentioned before, the ad product from OpenAI has developed, so quickly. It's almost every week. There's a new feature that comes out that, again, other platforms took months, if not years, to develop. And so they're very, very quickly getting up to the speed where they will be, from a feature standpoint, at parity with other major platforms. I think the interesting thing about ChatGPT ads, but also more broadly, even things like AI Max ads and sort of advertising in the AI era, is digital has been built on the premise of clicks and traffic. That is the primary way that you evaluate success. Like clicks, traffic, sales. That's how it works. Where the AI experience challenges that somewhat is that you can have a very meaningful brand experience. It's 10:30 a.m. here, so I'm not going to keep talking about beer. Let's talk about lipstick. So I have a great experience in a talking with ChatGPT or in AI mode. learning about lipstick and learning about the different shades and really deep experience. And I get brand names, I get product names, but I never go to a site yet, because then I might walk in store and then try it. And that's one of the attribution challenges that a lot of marketers are having at the moment. Intuitively, the value and importance of being present in these conversations is there. How that tracks one-to-one to the bottom line when conversations can end without a conversion to site, that is part of a challenge. I think Google's release of the generative visibility features in Google Search Console earlier this week are a good sign of where that will go in providing advertisers some insight about where their brand and products sit. But I suspect that will continue to be a challenge for the next 12 months, is in this migratory moment when we are moving from a click and link dominated discovery environment to a conversation and generative experience with AI, how the metrics and expectations of marketers adapt as well.
Yeah, I think we all know that, watching a beautiful ad on our television, uninterrupted, unskipped, versus a banner ad versus having an experience with a brand in the real world, there's a different level of attribution that needs to be assigned to having conversations with a trusted advisor, as many of people are becoming synonymous with their agents are essentially word of mouth advocates on behalf of brands in this new digital ecosystem, as important as a recommendation from a friend because of the trust levels and what we think they know about us and how well they're returning results. I think you have to apply a different level of value to that impression, even if the last click attribution isn't there just yet. But I think it's a brave new world. Well, John, admittedly, I occasionally will try and avoid AI conversations. They're almost unavoidable in our industry, but this was one of the most fascinating and well-informed and tactical AI interviews that I've probably done all year. So thank you for your time. It was really informative, and I feel like you added a ton of value to the audience. So if folks want to follow along with your thought leadership, get in touch, or learn more about what you're up to at Jellyfish, where do you want to send people to stay in touch?
You could follow me on LinkedIn. I sort of post articles pretty frequently and videos sharing our research and points of view. John Dawson on LinkedIn. But yeah, it's been great to talk to you, Dylan, and a really good conversation. And I think it's just a really exciting time to be working in advertising.
Indeed. And for those of you who are at home, if you're watching the show and seeing it for the first time, don't forget to give us a follow or a subscribe. If you're listening to the show, an honest review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on is how we find a larger audience. So please do that. And if there's a marketer out there who's trying to figure out their AI strategy, or maybe a technologist who is trying to implement some of these ideas in their daily workflow, or just trying to make sense of it all and would enjoy the conversation that I had with John today, don't forget to share